I'm Allison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special kind of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow while keeping their people energized. So whether you're starting a company or reigniting a team within a large, mature company, I'll show you what it takes to successfully drive business growth through conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. In this episode, we'll explore the world of fashion. Now, this is an industry that's changing so quickly, it's difficult to keep up with the pace of change. I'm going to speak with Gunjan Soni, CEO of Zalora, Asia's largest online fashion brand. Welcome, Gunjan.
Hi, Allison. Pleasure to be speaking to you.
So it's great to have you joining me on this Growth Leaders podcast. For anyone who's listening who's not familiar with Zalora, can you tell me a little bit about the organization?
Sure, absolutely. Look, like you mentioned already, Zalora is the largest fashion e-commerce player. We see ourselves as spreading between both fashion and lifestyle, including sports and home and beauty as well. In terms of our business model, I think what's really unique, and even people who know Zalora very well don't often know this, is that we're very focused on curation and working directly with our brand partners, which is quite different from a lot of other e-commerce players that focus heavily on getting as many sellers on board as possible, leaving the duty of checking good from bad to the consumers. And therefore, this often also means taking inventory risk because you want to work with the brand partners directly and bring on board only high quality products. On the other hand, I think what's also very unique about, and I would love sharing with everyone, is how diverse we are as a company. And not just on paper, but in practice. We actually already have more than half our workforce is women, and not just in the entire organization, but also in the top 50 leadership. We have 45% women.
So it sounds like your business is different from other e-commerce platforms in that because you're doing more of an active role curating the content or the products, and you have more of a relationship with your suppliers. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
And how has that impacted you as a business, the partnership that you have with your suppliers?
I think it impacts the business very positively because, it creates different ways of working. So we see our stakeholders as the consumer, as our brand partners, almost as equal stakeholders, and we also call them internal customers. And then in addition, of course, we have our employees and we have all the other external stakeholders. And what that does is, I think it keeps us honest in the kind of product conversations we have with our consumers as well. Because we take pride in bringing the brand stories alive. So we're not just selling products, we're really bringing the brands alive on our platform. And I think that matters a lot to the kind of brands we work with, because fashion is a lot about self-expression. And each of these brands have such a wonderful history and a story about what led to their birth or what is, true to their philosophy. And they're really, really passionate about it. And we imbibe that. So, equally you find that our employees, especially in the buying teams, are equally passionate about products. So they actually love what they do. And I think that then translates into the kind of communication we drive on our platform with our consumers in educating them about brands. And this has also led to very recently in us talking about sustainability, which is an equally passionate topic for both of our brand partners and us. And I'll be happy to talk about it later as well.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about how you bring a brand story alive. And I have to tell you that I'm the mother of 2 teenage daughters, and one of my daughters is so involved with her friends in the curation of fashion. And so I'm really interested in how you see the relationship between buyers of what you're selling as well as the creators of it.
That's actually a very interesting question because I think that also alludes to some of the shifts we are seeing in the industry and in the consumer behavior. You see, historically, the dialogue was always led by the brand saying, here's what we are, here's what we think is fashionable, here's what we think is not fashionable. And very consciously, Zalora stayed away from it. And we said, really, we are about bringing access and the entire width. We call it the limitless world of fashion to our consumers. But we are not here to judge, whether this is right or that is right. But interestingly, like you said, with your daughters, we are seeing that the next generation of consumers have very strong point of views of their own. And interestingly, that then starts to define what they think is fashion. And I think that's leading to the birth of what was called the influencer era, over the last 3 years. But even that is shifting, right? Because it's no longer just the celebrities who are influencers, but actually the peer groups are the strongest influencers. And what my friend thinks is the right thing to wear is probably the biggest determinant, in addition to all the other influencing that happens in and around the consumer's purchasing cycle.
I love that. It's like the democratization of taste and fashion. It used to be that others told us what was tasteful and what was fashionable. And it's like a different world where technology is really enabling it, because I see the teenagers sharing pictures. There's like a whole set of norms around covering their face, and they show what it looks like, and people say, this is what I think. Very different. I mean, it's actually a little bit old fashioned, like friends going shopping together, but also sharing for their broader community that cares about what they have to say.
Absolutely. And I think mostly it's a reflection of inherently how we think and act like humans. And therefore, technology is starting to mimic that more and more. And it's reflecting also the evolution of consumers becoming a lot more independent in their views and being very open about it. So I think you're absolutely right. Technology is merely the enabler. It's really how consumers think and act, which is then reflecting into these changes in how we're also adopting.
Coming up in the next segment.
You don't need to follow exactly what the browsing or purchase history was, but you need to factor in adjacent inspiration, as I call it.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
So you've been talking quite a lot about how technology is playing a role in terms of the buyer and how they interact with each other and express their opinions. What are some of the other ways that your industry has changed? So you've been in this industry for about 15 years. How do you see it evolving, and what challenges does that give you as a leader?
Right. I mean, I've been in fashion e-commerce now for 5 years, but I've been in deep consumer industries, like you said, for over 15 years, starting my career originally with McKinsey. And a lot has definitely changed. I think in particular, the role that technology is playing in creation of entire industries. I mean, e-commerce wouldn't have existed without technology to start with. So it's at the basic level, it's a different way of serving the same inherent need of retail purchases. But then, from there on, it's evolved in many different ways. So I think number one, and maybe bring it alive, one is personalization. So again, mimicking the human interaction when we used to go shopping in the old days together as a group. It was really the skill of the salesperson or the specialist, often in stores, who would provide us the right advice. And, a lot of our purchase experience was shaped by the quality of that advice and interaction. What technology is doing is allowing us to do it at scale, which is personalization. And, so it's almost like in the ideal world, you will be meeting your perfect retail specialist and your own personal assistant every time you come shopping. And that's happening more and more. Traditionally it started with the recommendation feeds, which we are very strong on as well. But in fashion, it has a twist, because it's not as simple as saying, hey, you read books by this author, and therefore let me recommend you the same author or the same genre. Here, I call it like, plus minus one personalization. So you need to think a little ahead. Just because somebody bought a denim, doesn't mean that they wouldn't be willing to try something which is adjacent to it, right? So plus one in this case would mean that if you bought a denim in the past, can I now, recommend you something cropped with it, or a ripped denim? So basically, you don't need to follow exactly what the browsing or purchase history was, but you need to factor in adjacent inspiration, as I call it. So that's one example of how technology is learning and our algorithms are becoming better and better. at predicting people's taste by looking at, a history of data of what they've shopped, but what others have also shopped, which could inspire them.
That's such a great example of how technology is becoming like the best salesperson. Because if you think about a great shopping experience, a salesperson is super helpful. And they're giving you ideas, encouraging you to try things you might not try. And so I love that that's kind of how you're describing technology doing it and then doing it at scale.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it fun. And, I often call it using both the left and the right brain in the work that we do, right? So we have to simultaneously use data and algorithms, but then we need to marry it with a good dose of creativity and inspiration to make sure that we're not getting over-structured in the recommendations we give, but we are leaving scope for imagination and possibilities, as I say. And technology is getting better at it. It's still not perfect, and there are ways in which we can keep improving, but it's already far better than what it was several years ago. Another interesting example I'll give you of how technology is making a difference to the purchase cycle and experience is the introduction of entire looks. So one thing we do religiously is on a weekly basis listen to our consumer calls into our call center and try and derive insights from it, in addition to doing direct conversations and surveys. And what we found was that often people say, okay, I like the way you show the product, but you're selling only the top. I wish I could get that bottom. I wish I could get that heel. And we realized that actually, when we do the model shoots, all the products are from our own curation. So technically, they're all available, but just the consumer can't find it easily. So we introduced a feature called Shop the Look. And what that does is that, if you like one particular product that you're browsing, but you want to check out the entire look, it shows you all the products associated, including even the makeup that the model is using if you so choose to be inspired. So makeup, accessories. And it's led to some wonderful results for us in the last 3 months since we launched, because not only are people happier, but they're actually shopping more, and which is good for our business.
That's great. I love that story about it's almost like saying, this is what you could do. If you thought about this as opposed to, here, let me sell you another thing.
Exactly, yes.
Now, I'm really interested in another fashion trend that I observe in my daughter, which is that she and her friends buy at thrift shops. Now, when I was growing up, I wouldn't have been caught dead in a thrift shop. But I see increasingly young people are buying secondhand, they're wanting to be thrifty. There's this kind of cool, or frugal is the new cool. What's that about? Is that really a trend?
Well, it is actually. And, we look at a lot of research into the millennials and then the Gen Z, as you call them. And, this particular trait, being practical, is one of the strongest traits that differentiates the Gen Z consumer in particular from the millennials. So what you're seeing is definitely a trend. As more and more of the Gen Zs become consumers, we're going to see more adoption of it. It has many manifestations. I think one of it is the practicality of going for value consumption. The second is, of course, ease of access. So, they are more than anybody else digital natives, and therefore open to all kind of formats from where they can get access to products that they like. But last but not the least, they're also showing trends towards, conscious consumption. And when you combine all these three, I think some of the models which will evolve will be around circular fashion. And that's again something that I'm personally very passionate about, especially in the Southeast Asia context, because affordability is still a challenge in many geographies. But people's aspirations are very high because they've been exposed, they're much more traveled than their previous generation. On the same hand, acutely being in the fashion industry, I'm aware of the impact that fashion has on the environment. So 70% of what gets produced is wasted eventually. And one can change that. And I think this generation, more than any other generation, will be spearheading that moment, and that shift is happening around us. A couple of models therefore come to mind, right? You talked about rentals, you talked about secondhand purchases. So at Zalora, we actually in December did our first partnership to start offering secondhand. We call it pre-loved, since we are so much in love with our product.
That's a great brand. Pre-loved.
So, it's not pre-owned for us. It's actually
Yep.
pre-loved because, obviously we expect our consumers to be loving the products that they had, and they're now parting way with it because they've had too much of the good thing and they want to try something else. But the product still has very good shelf life. And we started first with the luxury category because in that category, it's easier to authenticate the product. And I think that's one big challenge in the secondhand economy. How do you make sure that the product that you're selling is actually authentic? And therefore, for us, it led to massive debates internally saying, how would we handle this? Because, like I said in the beginning, one of our promises is working directly with the brands to bring authentic, 100% authentic product to a consumer. So we've started with luxury, but in terms of adoption and in terms of the direction, I'm very convinced that many such models will evolve, including even donation. If you really don't want to sell the product, you could still donate it. And there are many people who are not so blessed or who would be very willing to benefit from it. And therefore, we're also in the background partnering with NGOs to explore that angle as well.
That's fantastic.
Coming up in the next segment.
Not assume that what's working well for you in your offline model will work well online.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
Sounds like a lot of change going on in the industry in how people buy, what they want to buy, why they want to buy. How do you keep up with all of this as a leader? How do you keep your organization going forward and keep people growing and changing fast enough to keep up?
I wish I could do more and more of it, but I think first and foremost, what's important is listening. And I think listening to your consumer, listening to your employees, especially, those which are below the first few layers, because they always have the most creative ideas and are also most closely rooted to the practical realities of running and operating the business, but also listening to the environment and the changes that are happening around us, listening to stakeholders, the brand partners. And I think that first and foremost brings information and insight. And I think the more senior you grow, unfortunately, the less people are willing to speak to you openly. And I think, therefore, you need to really over-invest in both your own tendencies to let me tell you the answer, and also equally making an extra effort to let people share and create processes and even opportunities for people to do that. But to me, that's super important because that starts to inform a lot of the challenges that you will face. Because by the time you're already in the middle of a crisis, it's very, very hard to recover and shift. So it's super important. And I'm personally a big believer in looking ahead and trying to be as predictive as possible. So I think that's number one.
Gunjan, give me a really specific, simple example of how you listen to others, because I think that a lot of leaders say that, and then it's really hard to do. So as the CEO, how do you ensure that you're able to really hear what so many of these different stakeholder groups are saying?
I think that's absolutely true. It is very hard, like I said. I think there's some simple tricks that I've learned in my journey which tend to work more. I think the simplest of which is just making sure that in every meeting you're the last one to give an opinion. And first, just hearing from everyone in the room. And it doesn't depend on which designation they bring or even which function they belong to. If there is an important decision or if there is a different topic where we don't know enough, it's very helpful to listen from everyone first. I think that's very simple, very practical. The second is to actually proactively create some forums and opportunities. So like I mentioned earlier, I love listening, although I can't go and do calls myself, but I love listening into consumer calls to get that direct feedback. Sometimes the tone of the conversation tells you a lot more than the inscribed takeaways that will be shared with you later as a case study for improvement. And that's, again, another very practical way of doing it. The third is, seeing yourself and everyone you meet as a consumer. And I think at least in the business that I'm in, everybody does have an opinion and everybody is either already a user or a potential user. So that leaves a lot of opportunities to learn and get very, very different perspectives.
These days, it seems that everyone wants to move into e-commerce. What's your one piece of advice that you would give to a leader that's looking at online sales of their products and services?
Well, yes, the times have changed a lot, and people are definitely, given the environment around us being COVID, like you said, looking at e-commerce a lot more seriously. To be honest, this has been happening, although not at the same pace for the last 3 to 5 years, actually. And we've seen more and more of our own partners either strengthen the relationship or experiment with models of their own. In terms of advice, I think the simplest one would be to not assume that what's working well for you in your offline models will work well online. And I know, again, like listening, this is probably the easiest one to say, but the hardest to implement, simply because a lot of your past success is driven by those learnings and insights. And therefore, it's really, really hard to completely let go of them and learn and do a different way of working. What can make it easy is to actually invest in a different team. And if you can't set up a different business, at least set up a different business unit. And I think that's at least, one thing that I've seen help many larger organizations be able to incubate newer business models. And the same is true for e-commerce as well. And that will lead to a different kind of talent coming your way and, will definitely increase the chances of success.
I think that's great advice because it's so easy for people to think, it's another channel to sell. And I think what you're saying is, no, it's probably a new business model. And your existing people may not be the same people who can be successful with a different business model. Now, Gunjan, as you and I speak, we are in Singapore and we are in a circuit breaker. And so everybody's working from home that can be working from home. And a lot of businesses are thinking about the future of their business and how they can be successful. So you mentioned about the challenge of not just trying to sell online, but to actually look at what business model is needed for your business if you want e-commerce. What would be some practical advice you could give leaders today who are maybe taking some baby steps into e-commerce?
I think the easiest approach, and the answer differs depending upon if you're a brand versus, you are a platform service provider. It's much harder for platform service providers to go online because they're offering services, and that takes time to establish protocols and then render. But for product-led brands, even outside of fashion and lifestyle and home, I think there are many opportunities. And while they are actually figuring out how to do it themselves, like you said, with the baby steps, because that journey can take time, what they can do is actually partner. And the good news is that there are lots of thriving e-commerce companies already that have the traffic, that have the eyeballs, and that have invested in the technology. And that will welcome you with open arms. So that's probably the easiest way to get started, especially if you want results fast. And then over time, you can learn whether in your situation, it's beneficial for you to continue with that model, or do you really believe that a standalone online channel is something that you want to eventually have in the end game?
That's great advice. Well, I was going to say that's really great advice because so often organizations or leaders want control. And so to partner means you have to give up some control. So I think that's a really great practical advice, which is maybe give up a bit of control, find the right partner where you bring something and they also do. And it may not be forever, but it at least teaches you how to operate in a different way.
Absolutely. And it gets you online faster, which is very important, especially when you're reacting to a crisis situation, when time is really of the essence. I mean, just to also give you an example from Zalora itself, we realized that our consumers at this time during the circuit breakers, the top of mind thing for them is essentials. And, we know that as an e-commerce platform with a very significant delivery infrastructure, we both have the ability, but probably also a responsibility to offer that to our consumers more broadly, simply because it's safer than having to go outside and, standing up in queues to be able to make your essential purchases. So we actually literally in 72 hours, onboarded and launched our essentials category in Singapore, in Malaysia, and it's now also live in Philippines. And we're starting to offer people personal care products, some of the other food essentials. You can buy your masks as well, and hand sanitizers and many other things. Again, our approach is curated, but we are pivoting to make that available. And I think brand partners are welcoming that, because whoever we reached out to, they said, oh, wow, we were really looking for someone to help us in this tough time because our store is shut down. And here you are to help. And I think, equally they'll find, therefore, very willing partners, even outside of Zalora, to partner with and help them.
Gunjan, thank you so much for joining me today. You've given me some great insights about fashion industry and where it's heading and some of the challenges and the complexity of a very complex industry and business itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think. If you have questions about growth or growth leadership, please email us at growthleaders@organizationsolutions.com. Growth Leaders is produced by Organization Solutions in partnership with MediaCorp. Many thanks to Dee Kirk, Sean Young, Barry Toe, Keith Tan, Zach Rasley, and Susan Eyring.